Long before apps tracked our every penny, our grandparents managed entire households with nothing but paper money and paper envelopes. In this complete retrospective and psychological analysis, we trace the history of physical budgeting and unpack the timeless psychology of cash that modern technology has actively tried to erase. The full history and psychology of the envelope budgeting system. This is the story of a personal finance method that nobody invented. Over the next 20 minutes, we're covering the full history and psychology of the envelope budgeting system, a money management method with no inventor, no patent, and no founding moment anyone can point to. What it does have is far more interesting, because this is a system that survived for more than a century, that rests on psychology that won a Nobel Prize, and that recently exploded back into popularity on TikTok with millions of views. We're going to walk through what the envelope system actually is, where it really came from compared to where people think it came from, the real science behind why it works on your brain, the companies that turned it into apps, and the reason a generation raised on smartphones started cramming physical cash into paper envelopes all over again. The basics come first. What the envelope system actually is. At its core, the envelope system stays simple. You take your income, split it into spending categories, and load physical cash into separate envelopes labeled for each one. So groceries get an envelope, gas gets an envelope, and eating out, entertainment, and clothing each claim their own envelope with a set amount of cash inside. From there, you follow one rule that never bends, that once an envelope runs empty, you stop spending in that category until you refill it next cycle. That's the entire method. No app, no spreadsheet, no math beyond addition. And the genius lives in that physical limit, because you cannot overspend on dining out when the dining out envelope holds nothing. There is literally nothing left to hand over. In practice, almost nobody runs every expense through envelopes. The method works best on variable, discretionary spending, the money that fluctuates and quietly leaks away, things like groceries, gas, restaurants, entertainment, and clothing. Your fixed bills, rent, or a mortgage payment and utilities, those keep flowing electronically, since they barely change month to month and nobody feels tempted to splurge on an electric bill. People sometimes call this a zero-based system, built on the idea that every single dollar gets a job before you spend it. This differs from other popular methods like the 50-30-20 rule, where you simply allocate 50% to needs, 30% to wants, and 20% to savings without the physical constraint. Here's the premise the whole thing rests on, that people spend less using cash than swiping a card, because physically, letting go of money stings more than tapping plastic. Hold that thought, because a mountain of research sits underneath it. First, though, let's trace where this thing even came from. The origins nobody can agree on. Here's the honest answer, that nobody knows who invented the envelope system. Most reputable sources state exactly that, with no single originator on record, and that matters because the internet overflows with confident origin stories that fall apart the moment you check them. You'll see it pinned on the Great Depression, that familiar image of a thrifty grandmother portioning out cash to survive the 1930s. A specific name even circulates online, crediting someone called Nathan Morris. And here's the thing. No credible historical, academic, or journalistic sourcebacks that claim up. It reads as pure folk attribution, the tidy story the internet manufactures because nobody knows lands as an unsatisfying answer. We're setting that one aside. The grandmother in the Depression version carries a similar flaw, and the issue isn't that Depression-era thrift wasn't real, because it absolutely was. The trouble lives in the timeline, since the earliest documented uses we can actually find predate the Great Depression by more than a decade. Travel back to 1916. In the Evening World, a New York newspaper running a thrift campaign that asked readers to share their savings plans, one reader wrote in with this: "Like most of your correspondents, I too divide my money systematically, putting aside in envelopes money for my various expenses. Without some such system, saving is practically impossible, What you save in one instance flows out unnecessarily in some other way. That was 1916, describing the envelope system almost exactly the way we describe it today. Now jump to 1918, to the New York Tribune, and a story headlined, "Find Out What's in Your Envelope." Written as a conversation between two women, it has one of them explaining, "I use 6 budget envelopes. Every week when I get my pay envelope, I have my money changed into small bills. And before I spend a cent, I slip into each of these envelopes the amount of money that belongs to each." The piece closes on a line that still rings true, that the envelope method makes it so much easier when you know what's in your pay envelope to get what you want out of it. 6 envelopes, cash divided before spending a cent, written down in 1918. The system reaches back at least that far, and almost certainly further. We simply lack a clean paper trail before then. One bit of honesty belongs here, that those 2 newspaper quotes come from genuine publications held by the Library of Congress, yet they reach us through a secondary source, so treat them as the earliest documented evidence rather than the absolute first instance ever recorded. The envelope itself stretches back even further, since the modern envelope came of age in Britain around 1840, which means people have held the raw material for this system for a very long time. The takeaway here is straightforward. No single clever person dreamed up the envelope method in one dramatic moment, because it emerged quietly from ordinary people fighting to control their money. The reason it kept working across more than 100 years sits buried in how the human brain handles money. And that's where this story gets fascinating. The psychology of why it works. This is the part most people skip, and it happens to be the most important because it separates a folk tip from a method with real science behind it. It begins with an idea called mental accounting. Back in 1985, an economist named Richard Thaler published a paper titled Mental Accounting and Consumer Choice in the journal Marketing Science, and his core insight cut against common sense. People don't treat all their money as one big interchangeable pool, instead sorting it mentally into separate accounts and handling each one differently, even though a dollar rationally remains a dollar no matter what label we slap on it. If that sounds abstract, the envelope system turns it into something you can touch. Drop cash into a groceries envelope, and that money genuinely feels different from the cash sitting in the entertainment envelope, which means you've made it non-fungible, hard to mentally shuffle from one job to another. That friction is precisely what stops the leaking. None of this counts as fringe theory either. Richard Thaler collected the 2017 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his contributions to behavioral economics. And the Nobel Committee described mental accounting as the way people simplify financial decision-making by creating separate accounts in their minds, focusing on the narrow impact of each individual decision rather than its overall effect. That description maps, almost word for word, onto the logic of the envelope system, and it earned a Nobel Prize. Stack a second concept on top, the pain of paying. A researcher named Ollie Zellermeyer coined that exact term in a 1996 doctoral dissertation at Carnegie Mellon, and the idea reads as plainly as it sounds, that spending money can register as an actual, almost physical ache. How sharply it hurts depends on how you pay. In 1998, Drazen Prelec of MIT and George Lowenstein of Carnegie Mellon published a paper called The Red and the Black that handed us the coupling hypothesis. The tighter the link, in time and in experience, between the moment you consume something and the moment you pay for it, the more that payment hurts and the more carefully you spend. Cash drives that pain to its peak, since the money leaves your hand at the very instant the thing becomes yours. A credit card snaps that link, letting you enjoy now and settle up weeks later, so the sting fades and the spending loosens. Here's the study that pins a number on all of it. In 2001, Prelec teamed up with another researcher, Duncan Semester, on a paper carrying the wonderful title Always Leave Home Without It. And people in the experiment proved willing to pay dramatically more when instructed to use a credit card instead of cash. The paper's own words put it bluntly, that the effect may be large, up to 100%, and it appears unlikely that it arises due solely to liquidity constraints. Up to 100% more. In one slice of the study, where participants bid on Boston Celtics tickets, the average credit card bids climbed to nearly twice the average cash bids, and a related figure from this line of research lands the premium around 83%. Either way, the form of payment alone reshaped how much people would spend. Then came 2008, when two researchers, Priya Raghubir and Joydeep Srivastava, published a paper titled Monopoly Money. They found that when a payment form feels less transparent, less real than handing over actual bills, people treat it like play money and spend more freely. And cash happens to be the most transparent form there is, because you see it, count it, and watch it vanish. For the brain itself in the picture, an MIT study from March of 2021 used fMRI scans and found that credit card purchases fire the brain's reward mechanisms in a way the researchers described as stepping on the gas, actively pushing more spending rather than merely releasing the brakes. Pull that whole chain together, because this is the real case for the envelope system. Money never sits as one pool in our heads, it splits into separate accounts. Paying with cash hurts more than paying with a card, and people will fork over up to twice as much on a card as in cash, while less tangible payment feels like monopoly money, and cards light up the reward centers of the brain. The envelope system grabs every one of those forces and turns it in your favor, which makes it less magic than behavioral economics you can hold in your hand. The people who took it mainstream. With no inventor to credit, the obvious question turns to who made it famous, and in the modern era, the biggest name belongs to Dave Ramsey. Ramsey started dispensing financial advice on the radio in 1992 and built it into a personal finance empire. His program, The Ramsey Show, reaches more than 18 million listeners a week by his own count. He's authored books like The Total Money Makeover and Baby Steps Millionaires, and he folded the envelope system into his courses while still selling physical envelope products to this day. Here's what matters though, that Ramsey never claims he invented it. In his own words, I found out that grandma's way to handle money still works. People used to always use cash envelopes to control their monthly spending, but very few do in today's card-swiping culture. He points straight back at the grandmother. His actual philosophy lands in another line of his. The goal of a budget is to assign every single dollar a name, on purpose, before the month begins. The quote he's best known for cuts to the heart of it: personal finance is 80% behavior and only 20% head knowledge, which, set against the psychology we just walked through, nails the whole point. The envelope system was never about math, it's about behavior. As the world drifted cashless, the envelope idea went digital, and a handful of companies deserve a mention. First up is YNAB, short for You Need a Budget. Jesse Meckham founded it in 2004 while finishing a Master's of Accountancy at Brigham Young University, and it began as nothing fancier than an Excel spreadsheet he and his wife Julie built to wrangle their own money, with Julie supplying the name. Mecham's motivation rings relatable, since in his words, he just wanted to graduate from college debt-free and still afford the occasional donut. He started selling the spreadsheet online in September of 2004 for roughly $20, then doubled the price on a whim from $9.95 to $19.95, and landed his first sale that very same day. Growth followed from there. A desktop version called YNAB Pro in November of 2006, an iPhone app in 2010, an Android app in 2011, and a shift to a subscription service on the final day of 2015. Meckham also wrote a book in 2017 that climbed the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. The whole YNAB philosophy runs on 4 rules, and the first of them, give every dollar a job, reads as pure envelope thinking. What people actually needed, Mecham put it, was a completely different mindset around money. Next comes Good Budget, which launched in November of 2009 under a different name, EBAR, the Easy Envelope Budget Aid. A San Francisco company called Dayspring Technologies built it with one explicit goal: creating virtual envelopes, and the rebrand to Good Budget arrived in late 2013. One design choice stands out: that it deliberately refuses to auto-sync with your bank accounts, leaving you to enter everything by hand, which the company frames as a privacy feature, and which, frankly, keeps you closer to your money in a very envelope-like way. Dave Ramsey's own app, Every Dollar, arrived in 2015 as a zero-based budgeting tool offered in free and premium versions. One more name earns a nod: Mavelopes, another digital envelope service, which shut its doors on December 29th of 2022, a small marker of how restlessly this whole market keeps reshuffling. Before these envelope-style apps took off, the dominant player was Mint, which got acquired by Intuit and later merged with Credit Karma, representing the older generation of budgeting tools that tracked spending after the fact rather than allocating it beforehand. Does anyone actually budget? The numbers. That raises a fair question about how common budgeting really is and whether hard data actually backs the cash versus card claim. So let's move through it carefully, with honesty about which numbers hold up and which ones deserve a grain of salt. Start with budgeting overall. A Debt.com survey found roughly 90% of Americans budgeted in 2024, slipping to 86% the following year, while a 2023 NerdWallet poll pegged 74% of people as having a monthly budget, alongside a more revealing detail that 84% of budgeters had blown straight past their budget and 44% of those overspenders typically reached for a credit card to cover the gap. Ramsey's own research clocked the share of Americans creating a monthly budget rising from 39% in 2021 to 47% by 2026, with the steepest jump landing among Gen Z, from 38% up to 53%. The pressure underneath all of it reads as painfully real, since Debt.com found people living paycheck to paycheck swelling from 50% in 2022 to 69% in 2025. Now we turn to the cash versus card numbers. You'll often hear a Dun & Bradstreet study claiming people spend 12 to 18% more on credit cards than with cash, a figure quoted just about everywhere, and honesty demands a flag here, because the original study proves hard to actually verify, so treat that one as illustrative rather than gospel. The same caution applies to a widely repeated claim that the average McDonald's order jumps from $4.50 in cash to $7 on a card, repeated constantly, yet tough to trace back to a primary source. Better sourced material exists. A 2016 Federal Reserve Bank of Boston report found the average cash transaction running about $22 against $112 for non-cash transactions, and the peer-reviewed studies already covered that up to 100% premium from Prelec and Semester stand as the strongest evidence of the lot. The direction holds steady across every source, that people spend more once they stop using cash, so the only real caution is which exact percentage you decide to trust. The apps push their own figures too. YNAB says its average user banks around $600 in the first 2 months and over $6,000 across the first year, with 90% of users reporting improved finances, while Every Dollar claims its average active user uncovers an extra $790 in the first 2 months. Those come straight from the companies, self-reported rather than independently checked, so take them as marketing, though they do point in a promising direction. The criticisms. For balance, since no method runs flawless, the envelope system draws real criticism worth airing. The most glaring problem is that cash grows more impractical by the year. We live in a digital, online economy where you simply cannot stuff bills into an envelope to pay for something on a website, and a security issue rides alongside that because physical cash can vanish through loss or theft with no chargeback or fraud protection to claw it back. Opportunity cost bites too. Cash parked in an envelope earns zero interest, surrendering whatever it might have grown in a high-yield savings account, and it forfeits any credit card rewards on top of that. An even larger long-term worry hangs over young people that paying only in cash builds no credit history at all, since cash never reaches the credit bureaus, and a thin credit score can later choke your odds of landing a mortgage, renting an apartment, or scoring decent insurance rates. One financial expert, Priya Malani, the founder of Stash Wealth, branded the cash trend a resurfacing of a trend that probably should have died a while ago, precisely because money kept in cash bleeds value to inflation over time. Dave Ramsey's wider advice attracts its own debates. His debt snowball method, which has you knock out the smallest debts first for the psychological wins, gets criticized by some as mathematically inefficient, next to attacking the highest interest debts first with the debt avalanche method, though defenders argue, and some research agrees, that the motivation from quick wins helps people actually cross the finish line. Ramsey also stands famously against credit cards altogether, reportedly keeping a credit score of 0 on purpose and favoring debit, and critics push back on a few other stances of his, like preferring actively managed funds over index funds and recommending a $1,000 starter emergency fund that some consider far too small. None of that wipes out the envelope system's value, yet a sharp budgeter ought to know the trade-offs, the modern revival, cash stuffing. All of which leads to the strangest twist in the entire story. In an age where cash is dying, a generation raised with phones glued to their hands hauled the envelope system back into the spotlight and handed it a fresh name: cash stuffing. Across 2021 through 2023, cash stuffing detonated on TikTok, the same 100-year-old envelope method dressed up for a new era with aesthetic budget binders, oddly soothing ASMR videos of cash being shuffled and sorted, and weekly stuffing rituals. Depending on the source and the date, the hashtags have piled up anywhere from around 820 million to north of 3 billion views. And while the exact figure swings wildly, the sheer scale isn't in doubt. The face of the movement is a woman named Jasmine Taylor out of Amarillo, Texas. Taylor started posting cash-stuffing videos in early 2021 while buried under roughly $70,000 in debt, about $60,000 of its student loans plus another $9,000 in medical and credit card debt. And she funneled her $1,200 stimulus check into launching a business called Baddies and Budgets, selling the supplies themselves, the envelopes, the wallets, the binders. The thing took off. Revenue hit around $850,000 in 2022, sat on track for $1 million in 2023, and reached $2 million in 2024, while Taylor herself cleared more than $23,000 of her own debt in that first year. Her advice stays about as old school as it comes. In her words, "I found cash budgeting and I literally stuck to it. I would only spend what I had in cash, or strip down even further, give your money a job." Why this caught fire now with this generation comes down to a few forces. Economic uncertainty bred a craving for tangible control, and something deeply satisfying lives in physically seeing your money, especially when so much of modern life dissolves into invisible taps and swipes. Survey data reinforces it, since an Intuit Credit Karma survey from May of 2023 found 69% of Gen Z saying they used cash more than they had a year earlier, while nearly a quarter, 23%, reported using cash for the majority of their purchases. For a generation slamming into credit and inflation for the first time, the envelope system offers the very thing it offered that reader back in 1916, a way to make saving feel possible. Even the apps don't sail smoothly. Why NAB lifted its annual price to $99 a year in December of 2021, up from $84, and before that a mere $50, which kicked off genuine backlash among longtime users online. The tools keep evolving. The prices keep climbing, the trends keep cycling, yet the underlying idea flatly refuses to die. Conclusion. Let's circle back to where we opened. This is the story of a budgeting method that nobody invented, and that turns out to be the most surprising thing about it. There was no single genius, no patent, no founding moment, only ordinary people who reached as far back as 1916 and discovered that physically dividing your money, then refusing to spend past the envelope, finally hands you control over it. The reason it has outlasted a century, survived the slow death of cash, and resurfaced as a viral trend comes down to something real about the human brain, namely mental accounting that won a Nobel Prize, the pain of paying, and the plain fact that we'll spend up to twice as much on a card as in cash. The envelope system doesn't wrestle against those instincts. It recruits them to work for you. It isn't perfect, since cash earns no interest, builds no credit history, and can slip away. Yet, as Dave Ramsey put it, personal finance is 80% behavior and only 20% head knowledge, and maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath all of this. The most powerful money tool ever built isn't an app or an algorithm. It might just be a paper envelope and the simple century-old discipline of stopping when it runs empty. If this shifted the way you think about your money even a little, then it did exactly the job it set out to do. Take care of your envelopes and take care of yourself.